The global media remains fixated on the muddy trenches of eastern Ukraine, counting every square meter of territory exchanged in a brutal war of attrition. Mainstream outlets tell a story of stalemate, focusing entirely on artillery duels and frontline skirmishes. They are pointing your attention to one specific corner of the map, completely missing the real tectonic shift happening hundreds of miles away. Deep within the heavily fortified waters of the Gulf of Finland lies the Kronstadt Naval Base, the official headquarters of the Baltic Fleet of Russia, and a sanctuary fortress that was deemed absolutely untouchable by Western intelligence and military strategists alike. That illusion of absolute security shattered into pieces on June 3, 2024. The first separate center of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces bypassed layers of advanced air defense systems and electronic warfare nets to strike a catastrophic blow at the very heart of the naval power of President Vladimir Putin. Mainstream commentators are describing this as a minor tactical raid on a single ship undergoing routine maintenance. They are fundamentally wrong. This single overnight operation did not just damage a surface vessel, it effectively decapitated the silent financial lifeline that keeps the war machine of Moscow breathing. This strike targeted the primary guardian of the multi-billion-dollar shadow fleet of Russia, a covert armada of unregistered tankers that funds 40% of the federal war budget. By disabling the modern corvette Boikiy, Ukraine did not just win a naval skirmish without deploying a single traditional warship. They exposed a fatal vulnerability in the global energy supply chain, a disruption that ripples directly from the burning docks of Saint Petersburg straight to the local gas station where you fill your automobile. The rules of engagement have changed forever, and the economic aftershocks are only just beginning to surface. At exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes in the morning on June 3, 2024, a suffocating silence hangs over the Gulf of Finland. In the luxury suites of St. Petersburg, just 20 kilometers away, foreign delegates and oligarchs are fast asleep anticipating the opening ceremonies of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. They are wrapped in a false sense of absolute security, believing the military might of the Federation protects their investments. This is the ultimate posture of arrogance. But hundreds of miles to the south, inside a windowless command center shrouded in darkness, the atmosphere is entirely different. Technicians from the first separate center of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces sit in front of glowing monitors, their fingers resting calmly on flight controls. They are not launching a massive, loud missile barrage. They are guiding stealth ghosts through the night. By 2 hours and 27 minutes in the morning, the operation enters its critical phase. Low-flying, long-range, unmanned aerial vehicles approach the heavily fortified perimeter of the Kronstadt Naval Base. On paper, this base is protected by the most sophisticated multi-layered air defense network money can buy. Yet Russian radar screens remain completely blank. Military analysts offer two highly compelling hypotheses for this catastrophic intelligence failure. The first theory suggests that Ukraine utilized advanced satellite communication links that completely blinded Russian electronic warfare countermeasures, rendering their jamming equipment useless. The second, more terrifying scenario for the Kremlin is that local operators were standing on Russian soil, directing the final approach of the drones from just outside the base gates. If true, it means the perimeter was breached from within. No alarms ring out. No interceptors launch. The silence remains unbroken. Then, at precisely 2 hours and 41 minutes in the morning, the illusion evaporates. The optical sensors on the lead Ukrainian drone capture a high-definition silhouette of their primary target, the Staroguzhchi-class corvette Boikiy, sitting vulnerably inside the dry dock of the base. The video feed, later verified by independent open-source intelligence groups, shows the drone descending at a sharp angle. It does not aim for the hull. It does not aim for the engine room. The operator deliberately steers the craft directly into the center mass of the warship. A violent explosion tears through the superstructure, immediately followed by a second direct hit from a trailing unmanned vehicle. The impact ignites a massive, uncontrollable inferno that quickly engulfs the bridge and the main tower of the vessel. The tactical precision of this strike is highly telling. The drone operators did not just want to damage a ship, they engineered a surgical strike to decapitate its technological heart. The center mass of the corvette Boikiy houses the most expensive, sophisticated, and irreplaceable electronic components in the entire Baltic fleet. Within seconds, the FERC-2 airborne surveillance radar, the Monument A guided missile radar, and the advanced electronic warfare suites are reduced to molten slag. The ship is not resting at the bottom of the ocean. It is still floating in the dry dock. Yet for all practical military purposes, it is completely dead. as emergency fire crews frantically pump tons of water onto the blackened, collapsing structure. They inadvertently destroy any remaining delicate circuitry that survived the initial blast. The Russian leadership thought their crown jewel was untouchable. They thought their defenses were flawless. They thought their enemy was out of reach. The reality is devastating. To truly understand the chaos radiating from Saint Petersburg, you must look past the immediate damage of burning metal and smoke. Mainstream news operates on a superficial level, treating the strike on the corvette Boikiy as a simple tally mark in a war of attrition. To uncover the real truth, you must look beneath the surface of the water, straight into the hidden flows of global capital and energy logistics. The Kronstadt Naval Base was never just a random military outpost. For over 3 centuries, this fortress has served as the ultimate gatekeeper of the Baltic Sea, designed by imperial czars and expanded by Soviet strategists to project raw intimidation against Northern Europe. It was built to control the Gulf of Finland, a critical maritime choke point that allows Moscow to maintain a permanent threat vector against the eastern flank of NATO. But in the modern geopolitical arena, the true value of Kronstadt is not measured by the caliber of its naval guns, but by its proximity to the financial lifeblood of the Kremlin. When Western nations leveled tens of thousands of unprecedented economic sanctions against Moscow, the survival of the regime depended on a single massive deception. The Kremlin engineered a clandestine maritime network known globally as the Shadow Fleet. This is an untraceable, decaying armada of aging oil tankers sailing under flags of convenience, operating without standard international insurance, and carrying millions of barrels of crude oil across the globe. According to reports from the Royal United Services Institute, the Federation expended over $14 billion to assemble this covert fleet. The revenue generated by these ghostly vessels is staggering, providing as much as 40% of the federal war budget of the country. If the Shadow Fleet stops sailing, the war machine completely collapses. This is exactly where the corvette Boikiy entered the equation. The vessel was never meant to be a frontline combatant in the traditional sense. For years, its actual mission was far more critical to the economic survival of the Kremlin. The ship functioned as an armed military escort for these illicit tankers as they navigated the narrow, highly scrutinized waters along the borders of NATO nations. The presence of a modern warship equipped with the Redoubt air defense system provided a vital layer of deterrence, preventing European authorities from intercepting, boarding, or seizing the Shadow Fleet vessels. The corvette Boikiy was the ultimate shield protecting the illicit cash flow that funded the frontline offensives. By crippling this specific vessel, Ukraine did not just damage a surface combatant. They pulled the rug out from under the security apparatus of the entire Shadow Fleet. The situation becomes significantly worse for the Kremlin when you analyze the deep structural rot within the domestic shipbuilding industry of Russia. The Staroguzhchi-class corvettes were promoted to the world as wonders of modern naval architecture, a perfect blend of stealth technology and advanced guided missile systems. In reality, they are a deeply flawed compromise. Independent defense analyses reveal that these vessels utilize highly inefficient engines and archaic propulsion systems, attempting to overlay modern electronics onto deteriorating Soviet-era engineering frameworks. The ultimate historical irony of this disaster lies in a closely guarded industrial secret. Up until the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the primary manufacturer of the specialized marine diesel engines used in these exact corvettes was not a factory in Russia. It was a state-owned industrial plant located deep inside Ukraine. The moment the initial campaign of aggression began 12 years ago, that vital supply chain severed completely. For over a decade, the Navy of Russia has been unable to secure brand new, high-quality replacement engines for this class of ships. Combined with a domestic shipbuilding sector that is currently starved of funds, corrupted by institutional mismanagement, and prioritizing expensive nuclear submarines over surface fleet sustainability, the damage to the corvette Boikiy is irreversible. The electronics are fried, the radar arrays are ash, and the specific mechanical components needed to rebuild the ship simply do not exist within the borders of the country. The untouchable fortress has failed, and the most valuable economic asset of the fleet is now a useless piece of scrap iron. The master strategy of President Vladimir Putin was designed around an absolute certainty that the deep rear of the Federation was an impregnable fortress. The timing of the military posture made this vulnerability catastrophic. June 3, 2024 was supposed to be the crowning achievement of the economic propaganda machine of the Kremlin. Saint Petersburg was hosting the annual International Economic Forum, a multi-day summit frequently referred to as the Russian Davos, designed to project an image of a thriving, sanctions-resistant superpower to global investors and foreign delegates. Instead of celebrating economic alliances, the international attendees were greeted by the sight of thick black smoke rising over the Gulf of Finland. The calculated display of strength transformed into a televised spectacle of vulnerability. The boomerang effect was instantaneous. The Kremlin immediately attempted to enforce a total informational blackout across all state-controlled media networks, scrubbing references to the base. But the receipts of this military failure are impossible to hide in the age of global commercial surveillance. Within hours of the strike, private high-resolution satellite imagery companies published undeniable photographic proof of the devastation. The images captured the precise aftermath inside the dry dock of the Kronstadt Naval Base. The bridge of the corvette Boikiy was heavily charred. Its primary structural tower partially collapsed into the center of the vessel. The photographs further showed emergency crews frantically pumping thousands of gallons of water into the hull, an action that inadvertently guaranteed the total destruction of any microprocessors and advanced electrical wiring that managed to survive the initial drone explosions. Internal leaks from maritime personnel confirmed that the primary airborne surveillance radar system was reduced to ash. The diplomatic fallout quickly exacerbated the internal crisis. Representatives from visiting nations who were promised absolute security within the metropolitan area of Saint Petersburg suddenly found themselves within the operational radius of frontline combat drones. The psychological shield that kept the Russian elite insulated from the realities of the war was shattered in a single night. The true economic damage, however, is verified by shifts in global maritime logistics data. Just 48 hours prior to the overnight raid at Kronstadt, French naval authorities executed a high-stakes interception of an unregistered oil tanker named the Tagor, roughly 400 nautical miles off the Atlantic coast. This was a clear signal that NATO nations were preparing to aggressively enforce sanctions against the shadow fleet of Russia. For months, the primary factor preventing Western nations from systematically seizing these illicit tankers was the implicit threat of naval protection provided by modern surface combatants like the corvette Boikiy. By neutralizing this specific warship, Ukraine delivered the exact receipts Western intelligence needed to validate a more aggressive policy. The illusion of naval deterrence evaporated. In the immediate 72 hours following the strike, international maritime insurance syndicates reacted to the security breach by instantly raising war risk premiums for all non-standard vessels navigating the Baltic Sea. Independent shipping registries recorded multiple shadow fleet tankers abruptly altering their courses, fleeing the standard transit lanes, or dropping anchor indefinitely to avoid detection. The capital markets recognized that the security umbrella of the Kremlin was broken. The very asset designed to safeguard the 40% of the federal war budget generated by oil revenue was rendered an expensive pile of scrap iron in a vulnerable harbor. The calculated gamble backfired completely. You might sit at your desk thousands of miles away from the chilly waters of the Baltic Sea, watching the news and believing that a burning warship in a distant Russian harbor has absolutely zero impact on your personal life. You would be entirely wrong. The modern global economy does not operate in isolated compartments. It functions as a highly interconnected, fragile web of logistics and capital. When Ukraine introduced massive, violent friction into the primary maritime artery of northwestern Russia, they set off an economic chain reaction that travels directly to your doorstep. This is the moment where geopolitical strategy converts into a direct assault on your personal finances. Consider the immediate psychological shift within the global financial markets. The moment the corvette Boikiy was neutralized inside the Kronstadt Naval Base, maritime insurance syndicates in London and across Europe did not merely witness a military loss. They witnessed the erasure of a security guarantee. Within 48 hours of the attack, these massive financial institutions began quietly reevaluating the risk profile for every single commercial vessel navigating the Gulf of Finland and the broader Baltic Sea. When a geographic zone is suddenly classified as a high-risk combat environment, insurance premiums do not increase by small fractions. They skyrocket overnight. This is where the macro crisis lands squarely inside your wallet. International shipping conglomerates do not simply absorb these multi-million-dollar spikes in operational overhead. They transfer the burden entirely down the supply chain. every single corporate entity that relies on the transit of goods through Northern Europe must pay more to protect their cargo. This hidden expense cascades through international distributors, domestic wholesalers, and regional retailers, compounding at every single stage of transit. Furthermore, the disruption of the shadow fleet of Russia directly threatens the delicate equilibrium of global energy pricing. For over 2 years, the global market has relied on the illicit, unrecorded flow of Russian oil to maintain stable baseline supplies and prevent sudden price shocks. With their primary military escort disabled, these aging tankers are now highly vulnerable to interception by Western authorities or further asymmetric attacks. If the shadow fleet is forced to drop anchor or reduce its operations due to the loss of naval protection, millions of barrels of crude oil vanish from the global market practically overnight. When global energy supplies tighten, the price of international benchmark crude oil surges instantly. A sustained spike in oil prices functions as an invisible, highly regressive tax on everything you consume. It inflates the cost of manufacturing food, increases the price of transporting everyday consumer electronics, and directly raises the cost of utility bills to heat or cool your home. The inflation that erodes your monthly purchasing power, devalues your hard-earned savings, and reduces the value of your retirement accounts is directly fed by these disruptions. The ash from that burning radar tower in Saint Petersburg is drifting directly into your bank account. As the smoke slowly clears over the blackened hull of the corvette Boikiy, the geopolitical chessboard faces 3 distinct paths over the next 3 months. The first scenario, which represents the absolute best-case outcome for the Kremlin, involves an aggressive, covert scramble to secure illicit Western microprocessors through black market supply chains. If successful, naval engineers might patch the structural damage and restore the electronic heart of the vessel within 24 months. However, given the tightening grip of international enforcement, this option remains highly improbable. The second scenario is the ultimate nightmare for Russian naval command. Emboldened by this success, Ukraine deploys a massive, coordinated swarm of its newest long-range unmanned aerial vehicles, which possess a confirmed operational radius of 3,500 kilometers. This follow-up strike completely obliterates the critical dry dock infrastructure at the Kronstadt Naval Base, permanently freezing the remaining assets of the Baltic fleet and transforming the Gulf of Finland into a completely vulnerable zone. The third, and by far the most likely scenario, is a protracted, silent war of attrition in the north. The corvette Boikiy will languish as a useless scrap iron shell inside an insecure harbor. Stripped of their primary military escort, the aging vessels of the Shadow Fleet will face aggressive, systematic interceptions by NATO authorities and relentless asymmetric drone harassment. The vital economic artery that generates 40% of the federal war budget will slowly but surely choke to death. This entire crisis highlights a profound permanent shift in the very nature of human conflict. The historical era of the massive multi-million-dollar surface armada is collapsing under the weight of asymmetric technology. A swarm of low-cost expendable silicon drones can effortlessly blind and decapitate the most sophisticated naval assets an imperial power can produce. The traditional illusion of distance and the myth of the impregnable fortress have evaporated into thin air. This reality forces a critical reevaluation of global power dynamics. If a localized group of drone operators sitting in a dark room can disrupt the energy supply chains of a nuclear superpower and alter the course of macroeconomics, the traditional definitions of security are completely obsolete. Consider the true nature of modern military might. Are the multi-billion-dollar fleets maintained by the superpowers of the world truly the ultimate shields of national sovereignty? Or are they merely fragile, obsolete giants completely defenseless against the invisible, geometric expansion of cheap technology? State your perspective in the comments below.